Back in the early days of the Sanhedrin, the Romans wanted more influence and control over the area. In order to do that, they ended up bribing many of the councilmen that were in the Sanhedrin. They decided to make it seem like the Jews held power by having them, quote-unquote, elect an official who actually ended up just being a Roman. So the Romans were able to control who was in power and how they were able to spread their influence. Before the Romans were able to corrupt the Sanhedrin, the original chain of power was there'd be a chief priest, a vice chief justice, and then 69 general members. Once the Romans had decided to come into power, they had it so that way the head of the Sanhedrin, would most likely be a Roman. Then you'd have the vice chief justice, and then throughout the general members, you would have Romans. So in those 69 original members, you would eventually have Romans throughout. Whenever there was a decision on who would become the next chief justice or the chief priest, you would have the election as all the candidates being Romans, meaning that every single election was fixed and any decision made together as a group was deciding on who would be the next Roman leader, not the next Jewish leader. There were a few reasons for the high amount of corruption in the Sanhedrin, a few being the influence of the Roman agenda. What the Romans wanted was the final say, and if you were asked to vote for something in the favor of the Romans, you had to do it or else your life could be put at risk and you could be put to death. In order to counteract this fear, the Romans would often pay these general members large amounts of money. So decisions were now being made not only for fear of their lives, but also what could be more profitable to one of the members. This eventually led to the loss of many basic Jewish morals, leading to the large amount of corruption that was in the Sanhedrin. Jesus wanted to have the Sermon on the Mount to modernize the Old Testament laws after seeing the large amount of corruption in the Sanhedrin. After his sermon, he had a large amount of opposition not from the Romans, but rather the Jews. They were angry at Jesus for having these unconventional ideas that were not common to the Old Testament practices. Tool was a band formed in the early 1990s that still tours today. They openly disliked Hollywood, anything mainstream, and the Californication of America. The lead singer, Maynard James Keenan, often wrote their early albums while heavily addicted to heroin. His perspective is very different, being that he has been sober for many years. In 1996, they released an album called Enema. It tells of washing away everything that is glorified by commercialism in Hollywood and Western culture. There's an anger at the obsession with material things such as wealth, appearance, and self-righteousness. Both men were messengers, they were not leaders. Just as the mantis shrimp, things are not always as it seems. They were both disgusted at greed in such public places. In the case of Jesus, this included bribery in an open place, the Sanhedrin, which stands for justice. They were both tired of hypocrites trying to lead nations. Both men wanted to see reform against the hypocrites that ran their lives. They both tried to change a social norm, which is not a small feat by any means. In the case of Maynard, it was making sure Hollywood was not more important than actual news. In the case of Jesus, it meant making sure that he could go against the Sanhedrin. Both these men had ideas, and they will live on far past their own lives. In the case of Jesus, it already has.